So welcome back. And for the next hour, we're going to be discussing, I think, largely maybe among ourselves, but also with input as appropriate through questions, and referring a lot to the questions that you've given earlier in the day, the various topics. And I think there may be some questions coming for Rajesh's talk, perhaps from the audience. But let me start by just asking those of you on the stage here if there are any questions that were immediately prompted by Rajesh's talk just before tea. Chris.
Yeah, I mean, I had sort of a methodological question. You're talking about, what it's like to be another animal, sentient, say. The few experiments I'm aware of at attempts to communicate with dolphins or even other apes, they seem rather unimaginative. They sort of essentially conduit into a human mode of communication or channel of communication. I'm just wondering if anyone is thinking more out of the box about how to do this.
So the answer is yes, but slowly. So especially primatologists are beginning to look at more ecologically relevant kinds of tasks. So one of the things that came out was that if you look at tasks which were given, say 30, 40 years ago, they tended to be cooperative. While a lot of research now suggests that, competition is as common among, say, two monkeys as cooperation would be. And so how would you get them to do something that is relevant in a competitive situation is something that people are starting to think about. So my own group is studying deception, and we are trying to think of ways to get macaques to show behaviors that are deceptive in the wild, so not in a laboratory or a captive setting. But it's not that easy, and it's very, very hard to know for sure if you've gotten the behavior.
The concept or the idea that you put forward to have a kind of mind scope, it's quite interesting to have such a machine. But I think in Buddhist monastic studies, specifically when we do study the Buddhist ethics, there are certain areas where we debate a lot about what happens if a monk happened to kind of transform himself into a form of a tiger, and then while that monk is existing in the form of a tiger, if he commit to kind of kill another human being, is that an offense against the ethical codes? We have that kind of debate. So the general answer for that kind of debate is, as long as the monk retains that sense of identity, that I'm a monk, and I'm a monk, if the tiger commits an offense, that is an offense against the code of conduct. Now, as long as the tiger doesn't retain that kind of sense of identity, then it's not an offense against the code of conduct. So I think it could be highly possible if we kind of elevate our consciousness to that level, we can transform ourselves into a tiger. Like it's it's not very kind of specific to the Buddhism. Mm-hmm. Shape-shifting is a quite common concept in all the different traditions. Mm-hmm. So if we manage to shift our shape, then it could be possible to do that kind of study.
Right.
Unless I think to creating a machine, I think it could be quite challenging, you know.
I didn't mean it as, tomorrow's technology for sure. But actually, it's not clear how plastic our minds are, which is to say, are there intrinsic limits as to can we become monkeys? Can we become tigers? Can we become octopi? Can we become bacteria? Where does it stop? I mean, it's a question for which we don't even know how to approach the question at this stage, right? Scientifically. So that's why I don't mean that a machine will make you do it, but one thing that is happening is that people are getting better and better at using brain patterns to figure out what you're thinking. So just in the last year, experiments were done which roughly get into the ballpark category of your thinking. So if you're thinking about games, using the brain patterns, a computer is able to figure out, roughly speaking, you're thinking about games. It may not be cricket or this cricket game versus that cricket game. So it may not be very far in the future where, at least when it comes to other human beings, we can enter into their minds using their brains. Now, if it happens with other human beings, it can happen with other species too. So I think that once the technology develops, we will start seeing some very interesting developments. And you can imagine that if we are in a technological world where everybody is hooked into a machine which constantly gets inputs from other people's experiences too, who knows what kinds of consciousness we will develop as a result. So.
Several of the questions from the audience addressed to your recent presentation refer to the idea of trying to get some sense of another animal's experience by, for example, putting some kind of camera on a bird and then collecting the information as the bird flew around, and the idea that would that be sufficient really to give us a real kind of window into the bird's experience other than kind of a very narrow visual thing. And then another piece of that asked by another audience member was, is there any way that we would ever be able to get around interpreting whatever we find in terms of our own kind of mental constructs, since we're the ones that are ultimately doing the analysis?
Because the experiment hasn't been done, I have no way of saying what's going to happen, right? But I do think that if we start from something maybe less drastic, so put a camera on another human being and feed their visual input and their auditory input into another human being, so that what I'm hearing and seeing is what, let's say, Bryce is hearing and seeing, and not what actually is in my visual or auditory environment. I bet you after a while there would be a kind of, I would have a much better sense of what Bryce is about than what I have right now. That's my prediction, right? But this is an easy experiment to run, at least with people. With other species, just getting it going will be hard. But my general rule of thumb is, if the physical body and the molecular machinery and all of those, we clearly now know to be continuous across species. Right? We know that, it was pointed out this morning, right, that we are 50% yeast, or what was it, 47%, right? Something like that. So if that continuity is there in the biochemistry and in the genetic structure, why shouldn't there be a similar level of continuity in the subjective side? So, to me, it's a very strange assumption that we think we are similar to other creatures in their physicality, but somehow draw a sharp distinction when it comes to our subjectivity. It just doesn't make any sense to me.
Yes.
Tanda gengi this one do karso yul ba shimju jizam manga cha samgi ani yujin lia dona cher le de ko chi tinde cha de har se ko de ro ani tinde yujin di ani yujin de kande jil ngo sungo na ne korolle ba koron zam de te mai be yujin shenda chi ngo sungo na mena tanda ngal se bu juma so di chi sungo chi tas.
So it seems that what you are talking about is when we pay more attention towards the objective world, it compels us to look inside the subjective world. So when you talk about the subjective world here, do you mean the brain only, or do you have another entity which you are talking about subjective here?
I'm really not talking about neither the brain nor the body, just in terms of phenomenology, which is to say, what's it like for you? So, we know that, let's say, color is tied to wavelength, right? So, red is a longer wavelength than blue, and therefore, we perceive red and blue differently. But what's also true, though, is that color is a subjective experience, and it is in many ways independent of the objective qualities. So in this room, if you see people, and it's kind of, the lighting is very different from the outside, and even the spectrum of the light is probably different from the outside, and yet what's maroon here will be maroon outside. And so what's interesting about the subjectivity is the correlation between what might be the subjective variables of how you perceive color, how you perceive shape, and the objective correlates like wavelength and mass and density. And a lot of interesting work in the cognitive sciences has gone into understanding that relationship.
Tandangi kola chwa ta de kare sena ta so sine yo kele nyo ji ne ta ga nyen go di gola so chi nyen ton ro chma de ti kyen yo sikre ta kare sena do do ro de ta gi go ti gola ta busin chamo simbu chamo te yela mo zo ba ji ta ani mi se ate yili karsa yil mai ba tiri chi ko song ta tete chi di gala korang ye tang ye chen se ga chapar country so ne ta nga zo na ki ta ye tang ye chen ning ga mai ba chi ye tang ye chen ni se se wa na chapar yo ando tiri chi zona tiri song go yo ta korang ye tang ye chen se wa te country chi la zo ko yo na si to si ti
Simbu Tamudi, you maris reg.
ye re lo so
You raise me money.
yili maris
You lembe.
yil
You ching you
te yo ye re mi yil maris
Maybe I misunderstood your presentation, but as far as my understanding is concerned, it seems that from your point of view, the bacteria or the small organisms, microorganisms, they are the objective world, and human beings are not objective as these microorganisms. So if that, what I understood is correct, then from your point of view, how you distinguish between objective world and subjective world?
So I did not mean that that we are on the subjective side and bacteria are on the objective side. Though interestingly enough, Descartes, from whom a lot of these distinctions come from, put human beings on one side and all other creatures on the other side. So I'm going to just give his distinction, not mine. And his basic distinction was the use of language.
So I'd like to open up the discussion, beyond just putting you on the spot. And I know that you may have some other questions. And in order to open up the discussion a little bit, I want to throw out one thing that also derives from a number of the questions that came from the audience. Because even beginning after the first talk by Chris Impey on astrobiology, a number of the questions from the audience immediately went to consciousness and the evolution of consciousness in the universe. And some of the questions actually asked specifically for definitions of that. And I know you offered a definition in your talk, and I just want to throw one out to the panel to see what you all think of it, because I believe this is a hugely important definition to be clear about if there is going to be any kind of coherent dialogue. And the way I define consciousness, which is an operational definition that allows us to have a conversation that everyone agrees we're talking about the same thing, the way I define consciousness is simply awareness, an experiential awareness of being in relation to everything else. So what is it like to be me is my consciousness. And that kind of definition does not presuppose any kind of connection, brain function, or even necessarily with life. We don't know as scientists how to measure consciousness, but we have a very sensory perception centric position on it. We assume that in order to have consciousness, you have to have a nervous system, you have to have a brain, you have to have some kind of complexity. Whereas I am completely open to a tree being conscious, or a bacteria, or maybe even a rock, because I don't know what it is to experience being a rock. So I'd like to hear what you all think about that as a working definition of consciousness. What is it like to be something?
I agree, absolutely agree. It's important. You have to have something concrete. You have to start somewhere with definition. But a good definition begs a series of questions, and one question is, if that definition, and I'm not saying it does, so this is also a question, if it means a sense of self, that in turn means a sense of separation from other. So you have to have a sense of self and a sense of other. And that in turn implies you have to have a sense of relationship between self and multiple others, because there's only one self and there are multiple others. And it seems if you follow that logic and put those pieces together, then you define a landscape where it might be harder to argue that a tree has that attribute. A dog probably does, a mouse probably does, I don't know. But so my question, or part of the discussion then, is what are the connotations? You put a foundation stone in place that people can see it's the same thing and agree on for definition, but almost any foundation stone you can imagine has connotations or implications, and the implications and extensions are interesting too and have to be decided.
My part, according to the Buddhist study of mind and consciousness that I've explained earlier, and surely that does include whatever you have explained, whatever you told. But in general, we don't agree. We don't accept the idea that any tree or any kind of other things have or trees and kind of bushes have any consciousness. But in general, we don't agree with that. If they do have that the sense of self, and they do have that kind of substance that does have that clarity and then that kind of functioning of knowing something, then they should be. So this is the way how we put the definition, because according to the kind of logical studies, if you put forward a definition, that means it does make some conditions. And there are kind of 8 conditions those should apply. If something fits in that definition, and that should be definitely kind of acceptable as the thing to what you kind of put forward that definition. And if something is fitting in that kind of phenomena which you pose your definition, then it should be that definition. There are those kind of conditions. So this is logic. So according to the kind of logical thinking, as long as that kind of definition is met, I have to accept that it does have a consciousness. Even if it is a tree, or even if it is a kind of rock, if a rock has that capability to think, that I have to accept, that does have a consciousness. If there is another rock that doesn't have that capability to think, I have to accept that that doesn't have the consciousness. So it works in that way in the logical field, specifically in the Buddhist logics.
And of course, we're very limited by not knowing how to assess experience in anything, other than ourselves.
We don't know. I don't know if the rock feels or not, but I have to accept that as long as rock can think, that it does have a consciousness.
Another question to put on the table about the nature of, but still working from your starting point. Do we have to, or must we, or need we assume that an entity that has self, or has a sense of self, is a biological organism only? In other words, can there be other manifestations, other physicalizations of self that are not based on wet biology, DNA, the conventional, the things we've been talking about for the most part?
I actually want to interject there because, one thing that I don't think biologists necessarily, they don't know and they don't think that way, while physicists do, is what in physics might be called like universality, right? So what are the properties of having a self or having consciousness or any other property for that matter that one agrees is part of the definition and that maybe doesn't depend at the micro level on the substrate on which it is built on. So it's possible that there are other kinds of entities whose biochemistry is different, but which has enough of those macro level features that you would have to, and if, as you said, if it agrees with the definition, then you have to accept that it's conscious or has a self or any of those things. But we still don't, I don't think we have good ways of assessing what those building blocks would be.
And the almost simplistic example of why it seems worth posing the question is that when I think of my sense of self, it is not rooted nor interwoven with any singular sense of synapses operating or electrochemical pathways in my brain, nor the fact that I have carbon, based bonds at the base of the whole pyramid. And none of the other levels of it are manifest to me in my selfness.
Right.
I know that some of you may have formulated some questions that you wanted to put to the panel. Is that true, that you have some questions?
Well, let me introduce something while we're waiting.
Yes.
So let me throw the provocative idea that perhaps we shouldn't try to define consciousness at all. That it's a little bit like trying to define matter in physics. Physicists don't spend that much time trying to define what is matter, right? And then ask, is a light particle really matter or not? I mean, those are no longer productive questions in physics, and instead, because the mathematics has driven the subject so much, if something obeys the same kind of mathematical principles that another thing does, you just club them into the same category. And partly biology is not as mathematized a subject as physics is, but as we develop more formal accounts of how biological organisms work, we might find that we give up a lot of, you might say, naive categories, things like what is life or consciousness, and move to more technical categories. And my understanding of the Buddhist theories of consciousness and experience is that those are technical terms with very precise meanings, unlike the way that we are using consciousness in a more informal setting here.
당의 삼십돈 전이다 지금 저거 증이지 시간이다 동부 가르세이나 가서 낭식의 나올라 지팅킹 감스 잠롱 주부들은 잠롱시와 처자요 어떤지 송요레스 드니 가르시 리파 두조 가르 송고르잖아 그스기 짜모가 나올라 최소 네트비 자랑 사야 잘 하지요바 어떤지 저거 찍인데스 다 뜻이 되거나 되니 30대 니 nga랑 그 고용 되거나 대닌 태송로 전에 nga라 지 양찬비 초롱로 들이 종송세 디 진생 강에서나 다 당급 가서 yartunchen 기단 틀리 차르근 트치 때를 때니 가서 님이 침질 게니 데리 초호 디 게니 초호 자친 부지 두고요 지다 네 사실 좀된 디가 물론 이 동압제 트자 yarhun니 텐딘 트치 강라 마템버 잠롱세와 트자 텐디 요어 송아텔라 송옴스르chen 텐디 송바텔라 nga yamse chigen des tni chwate ka yesena da nga zo jikten di cheso kumta chapong thomate jikten jeng chapong chigli sor khilwa ina ne chanrik nang de tela mandupi tachil tni yore yo maris chwasha tongbuti
So before I ask this question, I just wanted to tell you one of my feelings, because in Buddhist tradition, there's a mention about around 1,000 universe in the whole. And also during one of these science classes, we are told that in modern physics also, like there are around 100 million planets which can exist life on it. So when I heard this information, I have found a similarity between these two traditions, like how life can be possible and how vast is our universe in both these traditions. And it gave me a kind of a strange feeling. And it also led to a caution for me. And so if we say that like the first cell or the first life on this planet came from another planet, then do scientists have any problem for accepting this kind of hypothesis?
This number of the world system was 1 billion.
1 billion.
1 billion.
For that, first, for what Geshe Lakdor said, it's kind of a remarkable coincidence, if you like, but the Buddhist number of the world systems, there are 1 billion. It's quite a particular number, and the 100 million number I gave in the Milky Way was just for Earth-like planets, habitable Earth-like planets. In our solar system, to take the nearest example, if you're asking how many places could have life, by any manner in microbial, we're probably thinking, not advanced life like us, it's about 10 or 12. There are 10 or 12 moons in the outer solar system that are likely to have liquid under a pressure, under a rocky surface. They have energy, they have carbon, they have water. So there are of order a dozen, 10 to 12 habitable spots in the solar system. So use that factor of 10 and you get a billion habitable spots in the Milky Way. So as in many things, the Buddhists got there first and got it right, but or we both got it wrong. But for the preceding question, it's very interesting, and I did want to come back to that. The speculation about life elsewhere, habitable worlds, and the vastness of the universe is old, of course. Lucretius was the first to speculate that there might be many habited worlds, and he was countered by Aristotle, whose weight in philosophy became stronger, and so the earth became the center of the universe, the only place with creatures. Thomas Carlyle has the great quote about possible worlds and with life, if they be inhabited, what scope for folly? If they be uninhabited, what a waste of space. So my question is actually for the Buddhist tradition or concept of life in the universe. Is there any sense or predilection towards, in that arena, of whether if it turns out by long tedious experimentation, we find out that most of these other potentially habitable worlds just don't have any life on them, and especially that advanced creatures of whatever form are exceptionally rare, that we may be unique. Is that a surprise? Is that anticipated? Is that, is there any resonance in Buddhism with the scarcity or abundance of life and intelligent life given a vast universe, which is clearly part of the traditional thinking?
I think according to Buddhist traditional studies and traditional thinking, the billion world system, there are a lot of possibilities of life in other world systems within this billion world system. So even in some sutras, they also explain that in specific world system, there are specific Buddhas, and they are teaching, and they are kind of diffusing the Dharma teachings and all those things. So from that point of view, philosophically, Buddhism have to accept that unless it is proved it is wrong by some other kind of other means. If it's proved it is wrong, then Buddhist scholars have to find out a different way of explanation for those things. This is very kind of a common approach in Buddhist tradition. Like if something is proved wrong, then there could be a kind of interpretation of that kind of teaching and that kind of sutras. And it has been done for more than 2,000 years by all these great scholars. So in general, Buddhism is very, very open about whatever is founded, and whatever is founded by experimental science or maybe some other source of science. So from that point of view, from the Buddhist point of view, life is always there in the vast universe. There is no shortage of life out there. It definitely is life. But we have no proof. We have no proof for that. We have no kind of any kind of scientific proof for that. We have a lot of literature, and but I don't know. We also have literature which says that the moon and sun are kind of taking the kind of rotation around the on the kind of sky over the kind of world. We also have literature like that. Now, if it is as long as it is proved by kind of experimental science that it is not like that, so I think maybe in future there will be kind of explanative Buddhist literature that may come out. Up to this point, it was not necessary because that kind of thing didn't happen. I think it is also related to kind of Eastern way of astronomy, which was quite prevalent in India and many other parts of the eastern part of the world. And even in the western part of the world, there were kind of quite similar thinking at the beginning. You know, like in the early time, the thought was like a geocentric world system and geocentric kind of a universe and all those things. So it changed in the course of time. And I believe that Galileo was one of the kind of, how to say, the great, explorer and great exponent of new version of explanation of the kind of solar system. And he paid for that with his life. So he was a brave man, and he had tools for that, to prove that. He created the kind of those telescopes, and through that he watched, and then he calculated it, and then he took notes, and he did that. If I think some scholar kind of who were interested in astronomy in India or in Tibet may have kind of developed a telescope to study that, probably they have said the same thing. So it's all about the kind of evolving of technology that have changed the viewpoint. So probably in future there will be more literature coming in a different direction.
Just a follow-up. I do have another question from your talk. One of the things that struck me about what you said was the sense that in the Buddhist way of thinking, both life, you said, and consciousness are recycled, endless, eternal. Yeah. That was very striking. So, and I'm not implying it's a point of distinction or deviation from the Western scientific idea, but it's a very interesting way to express it, because the Big Bang cosmology posits an origin and a time when there was no life because the physical conditions didn't permit it, and life exists now in the universe where once it did not, and by extension consciousness exists in the universe now where once it did not. And so my question is not really the distinction between those two views, but really there's an interesting consequence of eternal and endless and recycling consciousness, because what does that mean about evolution, the evolution of thinking or the evolution of ways of being, if you cannot place yourself in a timeline, in a situation of evolving? Not that everything has to get better or different or more complex or anything, but if time is not really a dimension of either life or consciousness in the universe, however you want to think of it, what does that mean? I don't actually understand that.
The thing is, in general, if there is a kind of infinite world system, we, the universe that we are talking about, the billion world system, we are just talking about within one universe. And there could be another universe, So if the Big Bang is the beginning point of this universe, and what about the other universe? Why there is no life in the other universe? If there is life in the other universe, why we say this is the beginning of life? Mm-hmm. So if there are multiple universes, there are multiverses, so there are more possibilities for the life. If there is more possibilities for the life, there are more possibilities for the consciousness. So from that point of view, there is no beginning point for the life and consciousness. But there is a possibility for the end of the life and consciousness, according to Buddhism. But that is a different way. That is philosophically how it is presented.
で、あれ、聖書の。
So this question is for Rajesh. And from your presentation, what I understood is that it seems that you are talking that the objective world, or what you see in the objective world, is not existing, not really existing as you see it, but the consciousness or the maybe a subjective world is kind of a real thing. So, does you mean that, or you mean something else?
Something else, though, not to. The argument is that you never really get to the world, the objective world as it is, right? It's always filtered through your sensory, your nervous system in particular. So, for example, you don't perceive wavelength, you perceive color. So, which is to say that even if the color is a representation of what's there in the outside world, it's still a product of your nervous system and not just what's in the world. On the other hand, it's not you're not inventing it, right? So when I see those flowers out there, it's not like my consciousness is inventing the flower pot, but it is representing it in a way that is driven by my nervous system. So there's a difference between consciousness being a full creator of the objective world and being a representative of the objective world in a way that is conditioned by your own biology and history and so on and so forth.
A question for David, actually, from the question you raised a bit earlier. In that definition or way of thinking about consciousness, does that necessarily connote memory? Because it seems like if a sense of self that's placed in an instant doesn't seem to me to be a sense of self. It seems, but I'll make it a question, not a statement.
Actually, why not? So I want to just interject.
Because you have to have a relationship of entities and events, and that implies some, a relationship in time, typically. So, is it wrong to suggest that memory is a necessary consequence or attribute of consciousness?
I would not make memory a requirement for my definition of awareness or consciousness. Even in human memory research, there are the very famous case of HM. The patient is known by the initials HM, who died last year, I believe, who had been studied for 50 years by neuroscientists for his very anomalous memory, where he had full awareness of what was happening moment by moment. But when he was a young man in his 20s, I believe, he had a surgery to treat a seizure disorder. And in the surgery, they removed parts of his brain, his temporal lobe areas, interior temporal lobe. And as a result, he had a particular kind of memory impairment where he couldn't remember anything that happened to him after the surgery for more than a few seconds. So he had full awareness of everything that was happening, and then 1 minute later, he would remember nothing. So there were researchers that worked with him for not for all 50 years, but for decades, that he had met literally hundreds of times, and every time he met them, he had no knowledge of having met them before. So, and yet he was fully present when he was present. So I see no contradiction with having a full awareness in the moment, even if that moment is only a nanosecond, and that be fully meeting the definition of awareness or consciousness in my operational way.
But, one can imagine a momentary self, so something that just arises now, perceives or is aware of the world now, and then disappears. And while memory and other higher capacities might help us integrate those moments, I don't see it as a logical necessity. But whether there are creatures on earth who are aware in the way that David mentioned, but who do not have any memory. I mean, HM is a anomaly, right? Because this is a person who has had something happen to him. But whether there's an actual fully functional creature that has no memory but some kind of awareness, I don't know.
And the different kinds of consciousness or the different kinds of awareness that different beings would have would be very different. I think it's important not to get locked into the way we experience our own consciousness as somehow being the way it is for everything. That if it be the case that a plant has a consciousness, it would be vastly different and even more different from ours than a bat's. So hard for us to kind of get
isn't that a
of
problem for understanding consciousness? Because it seems like the one thing that we are almost designed to view from our perspective. I mean, unlike, say, planets or quarks, it might be that for anything to be conscious, we kind of have to be like us. I mean, that's Nagel's argument, right? That to even understand some other consciousness, you have to be able to transplant it into our frame somehow. I mean, that's the...
Technically, in Buddhism, the existence of consciousness is it covers a kind of a vast space and vast area. The consciousness that we experience at present is a very limited part of it, and like in a very distinct form of it. In a very distinct form of it, the very coarse level of it. The further we refine that kind of consciousness, it may enter into different level of it, and then as a result of it, it could be possible that people may get born in different realm where there are only possibilities that in whole kind of a life term, they have only 2 occasions of remembering or feeling that I'm born here, and then I'm dying from here. So rest of the life, rest of that gap period, they don't have any kind of feeling and any kind of awareness, any kind of a functioning of mind about knowing anything or nothing like that. That is explained according to technically that is explained like that. Even that stage, we have to accept the fact that the consciousness does exist. So consciousness, technically according to the Buddhism, has different layers of it. So the layer that we are kind of using at present is a very coarse external layer. So I think it may not be reliable for the science to kind of look into all the things into that way, but then I think it could be quite possible that science may learn something from Buddhism in that field. But there are a lot of things those could be completely out of the kind of a study field of science. So from that point of view, as long as the consciousness exists technically according to the Buddhism, life should be there. So there is a possibility for the existence of life without even the involvement of in a tiniest kind of a substance or matter particle. So how can we search for that? There is no possibility at all. Scientists can't do anything in that direction or that field. Because science, the study of science, basically it starts with the theory, and it have to conclude, and it have to end with the experiment. It's very difficult to experiment these things through using the machines and all these things, unless you look into yourself. So, if a scientist look into themselves and they try to write down their own experiences and all those things, it's very difficult for the other scientists to approve it. So it's a kind of very difficult to be to do a scientific study in this field. But I think at the surface level it can be done.
But doesn't that problem arise when, so for example, if a teacher and a student are talking, so suppose there's a student who comes and reports to their teacher, I've had this kind of refined experience. How does the teacher authenticate that experience? I mean, wouldn't the same problem arise there?
No, this is a spiritual matter. When a teacher teaches the student to do this kind of practice and that kind of practice, and student does that and then gains some experience, he come back to the teacher and then explains him. Then teacher knows that he is at that level, and then teacher can guide him to that. But then scientists probably, I think, don't approve in that way. But it can be approved by the second person, but it is not approved by the third person in the same way, or by the fourth person. And scientists, the science, finding of the science is all to a certain extent, it's dependent on the democracy. It's acceptance of the acceptance by the majority. Like here appears like we are talking about Big Bang theory. It's becoming like a religion. No one can prove that through the experiment. Is there any experiment that can prove the Big Bang theory? No. So it's becoming like the religion, and majority is believing it, and that's it. That's a commonly accepted kind of scientific theory.
Well, as a scientist, I agree with you fully that Big Bang theory has become a religion. But also, I don't mean to be misunderstanding you, but isn't it the case that within, say, the contemplative traditions like Buddhism, or even pre-Buddhist, the Vedic traditions, is it not the case that there is some consistency of definition of experience, and that really that's the value of kind of the scientific aspect of contemplative science? I know that Alan Wallace has sometimes referred to Buddha as the Galileo of the mind, because he was able to very precisely develop technology to look within and have that verified by others when they also went there. And that's exactly what mind science needs, is a technology that's reliably and empirically replicable across people when you do the practice, for example.
Actually, I want to push that further, because it was already mentioned today. In fact, His Holiness mentioned that the Buddha himself says, don't believe what I say, but do it and accept it only if you have the same experience. But the basic question is, how do you know you've had the same experience as the Buddha? Right? And so how does within the tradition, what is the mark of saying that I've had the same experience as another person?
You see, the difference here is when you apply those spiritual values in your life, gradually it brings change in your life. And you feel that. If you observe in the right way, in the right direction, you feel that. But it takes time, It won't come in a way that you do a research for a couple of years and after that you come up with a huge book and say, this is my finding. It won't come in that way. It takes decades. It takes 20, 25 years. You need to spend lifetime. Then at the end, you will feel that your life is enriched by living that kind of value, living that kind of lifestyle. Mm-hmm. So, it's I think we should not look forward to make every scientist spiritual. So it's a very kind of impractical. But the thing is, if scientists really look forward to understand this mind, and then they should start looking within themselves and kind of observe their own feelings, their own perceptions, their own kind of different mental formations, and then try to compare it with the text. Where does it stand? Is that kind of meeting with those definitions given in the text? So in that way, they should study it. If they do that, then they will come to realize that, oh, that makes sense, unless it's very difficult.
As a scientist whose religion is the Big Bang, I will push back a little on the notion that Big Bang is a religion. To me, the Big Bang has the epistemological status of Darwin's theory of evolution. To most scientists, the web of evidence that supports it. Not to say that it couldn't be wrong. Richard Feynman says we make progress by trying to prove ourselves wrong as quickly and efficiently as possible. And my part of the reason I'm a scientist is I like that notion, not of being right, but of trying to make yourself wrong as quickly as possible. Do it quickly. And we've been trying to disprove the Big Bang, because that's how you go. And so far, it hasn't happened yet. And in the act of trying to prove ourselves wrong, the theory is strengthened. Its support now extends to the limit of laboratory physics, which corresponds to 1/10 of a nanosecond after the Big Bang. So we have direct, laboratory corroborated, predictive support for the theory back to 1/10 of a nanosecond in this history that took 13.7 billion years. It's possible, it's a house of cards and could just come tumbling down. But in the meantime, I'm kind of proud of it.
Go ahead.
I want to complement that by saying, experimental science is not the only kind of science that collects data. Observational science is traditionally and now as important as experimental science. So to say that only laboratory science gives you reliable data is I think a very narrow conception of science. Almost everything that we now consider crucial, let's take climate change. You cannot do climate change science in a laboratory, or you can, but really what you really want is the science out there in the observational world. So the kind of science that is built on observations and astronomy, evolutionary biology, and now increasingly ecology and climate science are, I think, as important as the laboratory sciences.